The Thing from Grey Hollow. Thorncombe was the kind of village that existed on maps only because someone, a long time ago, had bothered to name it. It sat in a fold of land where three hills came together and where a river too small to be called a river ran along its western edge before vanishing into a stretch of woodland the locals simply called the Hollow. By 1954, Thorncombe had a post office, a butcher, a church with a leaning spire, and a pub called the Plough and Sickle that had not changed its sign in 90 years. It had electric light on the high street and none anywhere else. It had 40 houses, one school, and a woodland at its edge that nobody liked to talk about. The Hollow was not large. A man could walk from one side of it to the other in under an hour if he kept to the deer track and didn't wander. But the trees grew close and old there, oaks and yews mostly, some of them older than the church, and the canopy shut out enough of the light that even in the midday the floor of the woods sat in a kind of green dusk. Children were told not to go past the tree line, not because of adders, though there were adders, not because of the old mine shaft near the northern edge, though there was too, half collapsed and fenced with rotting posts. They were told not to go in because their mothers had been told the same thing by their mothers, and nobody in Thorncombe had ever needed a better reason than that. This is the story of the summer that reason stopped being enough. It was the last week of July, and the evenings were long and cold the way they only are for about a fortnight a year in England, before the heat turns heavy and the midges come out in earnest. A group of children, 6 of them, aged between 7 and 11, had taken to playing in Miller's Field most evenings after supper. It was a scrubby stretch of pasture that ran right up against the eastern edge of the hollow, separated from the trees by nothing more than a broken stone wall and about 13 feet of nettles. They played football there, using 2 jumpers for goalposts, the way children did before anyone thought to buy them a proper net. The ball itself was a prized thing, a real leather one, stitched belonging to a boy, Peter Hale, who was 9 and the tallest of the group, and therefore, by the arithmetic of children, the one who got to decide when a goal counted. On the evening in question, a boy called Tommy Ainsworth, 7 years old, the youngest of the group, always trying to keep up, took a wild kick at the ball and sent it sailing clean over the wall, through the nettles and into the trees. There was a groan from the others. Peter's ball, Peter's rules. Someone had to fetch it, and it wasn't going to be Peter. "I'll get it," Tommy said, because he was the one who had kicked it, and because at 7 you don't yet carry the weight of what your mother has told you about the place. You carry only the shape of the words, "don't go in there," without yet feeling why. He climbed the wall, he pushed through the nettles, hissing as the stings on his bare shins, and he went to the trees after the ball, calling back over his shoulder that it'd only be a minute. He was not gone a minute. The other children waited by the wall. 10 minutes became 20. 20 became the kind of silence that starts boredom and slowly, without a single moment you could point to, becomes something else. Peter called Tommy's name, the others joined in. The hollow gave nothing back. No rustle of a boy pushing through the undergrowth, no muffled shout, no crack of a twig underfoot. By the time the eldest of them, a girl named Susan Yelland, ran back to the village for help, the sun had dropped behind the western hill, and the field had gone the colour twilight. Thorncombe's police presence, such as it was, had changed hands only 3 weeks earlier. The previous constable, a man named Griggs, who had served the village for over 20 years, had retired to his sister's house in Devon, and in his place the county had sent the younger man, Constable Edward Marsh, 28, transferred in from a town posting some 60 miles east. Marsh was competent, methodical and, by his own private estimation, entirely unsuited to the particular silences of a place like Thorncombe. He had been in a village 3 weeks, and had already noticed that people here answered questions the way you might hand someone a coin you didn't quite trust to be genuine. Careful, and only after a pause. He was at his lodgings, above the post office, writing up a report on a stolen bicycle, when Susan Yelland arrived at his door out of breath and crying, and told him a boy had gone into the hollow and not come out. Marsh did what any competent officer would do. He took down the details. He walked with the girl back to Miller's Field, where the remaining children stood huddled by the wall, pale in the last of the light. He established the facts as best as he could. The ball, the kick, the boy going in alone, the time elapsed. Nearly 40 minutes by then. He asked the obvious questions. Had any of them gone in after him? None had. And when he asked why not, in that particular tone officers use when they already suspect the answer will annoy them, none of the children would quite meet his eye. "We're not allowed," said Peter. And that settled it. Marsh noted the answer without comment and turned to the tree line, and found himself looking at the wood that gave absolutely nothing away. Word travels fast in a village of 41 houses. By the time Marsh had walked back to the green to organise a search, most of Thorncombe already knew the child was missing in the hollow, and a good number of them had already decided, quietly and without discussion, that they would not be joining in the search. This struck Marsh as odd before it struck him as anything worse. He stood on the green as the light failed properly, and he counted heads. 6 men had come. All of them were young, the eldest perhaps 35, most a good deal younger than that. No women had come, though several stood at their doors, watching, arms folded, faces unreadable. No older men had come at all, though Marsh had passed at least a dozen of them on his way to the village, sitting on doorsteps or leaning in the doorway of the plough and sickle, and every one of them had found some reason to look elsewhere as he passed. "Where's the rest of them?" Marsh asked one of the 6, a broad-shouldered young farmhand named Daniel Coe. Coe shrugged, though it was not a careless shrug. It was the shrug of a man choosing not to answer a question he understood perfectly well. "Working, some of them. Milking don't stop for a lost ball, Constable." "A lost boy," Marsh corrected. Coe said nothing to that. He only picked up the lantern someone had brought and started towards the wall. They went into the hollow in a loose line, 6 men and Marsh, each carrying whatever light could be found. 2 paraffin lanterns, a torch with batteries already fading, and one man carrying nothing at all, walking by memory of the paths. The wood was worse from inside than it had looked from the wall. The trees pressed close enough that the line broke apart within the first 100 yards, each man finding his own route between trunks and through bracken that had come up past the knee. Marsh called out to them to stay in earshot of one another. It was, he noted grimly, advice more suited to the training manual than to the actual experience of trying to walk in a straight line through several acres of ancient woodland in near total darkness. They called the boy's name. Tommy Ainsworth. The name went out into the trees and came back changed somehow, thinned, as though the wood absorbed more of it than an ordinary space would. There is a quality certain old woodland has, which anyone who's ever walked one at night will recognise and few can properly describe. It's not that the wood is silent. There is always some sound, high in the branches, the small movements of unseen things in the undergrowth. It is that the sound does not seem to originate anywhere in particular. It surrounds. It arrives from every direction and none, and after enough time of it, a person begins to feel watched by something that has no need to reveal where it is standing. Marsh, who did not consider himself a superstitious man, noticed that feeling settling on him somewhere around the 2nd hour, and noticed too that none of the 6 men with him seemed remotely surprised by it. It was Daniel Coe who eventually walked alongside Marsh long enough to talk, the 2 of them having drifted apart from the others during the stretch where the ground dropped into a shallow gully, thick with old bracken. "You'll not find him tonight," Coe said, without much preamble. "We haven't covered a third of the wood," Marsh said. "Doesn't matter how much you cover." Coe's lantern threw long shadows up through the branches as he spoke, and in the light his face looked older than it likely was. "This ain't the first time, Constable, not by a long way." Marsh stopped walking. "Go on." Coe hesitated, the particular hesitation of a man deciding whether the person he's talking to will laugh at him, and deciding it does not matter if he does. "There's summat lives in here, always has, long as anyone remembers. My granddad used to say it, and his granddad before him. Something that isn't a fox, isn't a dog, isn't anything you could put a proper name to. Folk go missing in this wood every so often. Not often enough that anyone out in the country ever comes to ask about it, often enough that we don't send our kiddies in without telling them why not to. A story, Marsh said, flat. Not unkind, but final. Aye, Co said. That's what I'd have called it too, before I lost my uncle in this wood, when I was 9. Call it whatever helps make you sleep, Constable. I'm only telling you what I know, and what I know is that the old folk in this village won't come near the trees after dark for any money you'd care to offer them. That's not superstition making them stay, that's memory. Marsh did not argue further. He had encountered enough village talk in 3 weeks to recognise the shape of it, old fears dressed up as old wisdom, passed down until nobody remembered whether they were remembering an event or simply remembering being told to be afraid. He filed it away, the way that he filed most things, and returned to the practical matter of the search. By 11 o'clock, the lanterns burning low and the men exhausted, he called it. There was no arguing the wood at night, not when the light had gone, not when the ground wasn't even. They would resume at first light with more men, and with dogs if the county would spare any. He did not say aloud what he was already beginning to suspect. That first light would be too late for whatever they were meant to find. The plough and sickle was still lit and still occupied when Marsh walked back to the village a little after 11:30. Damp to the knee and short-tempered in a specific way tired, worried men become short-tempered. He had expected the pub to be quiet. Given the hour and given the circumstances, it was not quiet. If anything, there was more noise inside it than had been all evening. Low conversation, the clink of glasses, the particular murmuring hush of a room full of people all discussing the same thing, whilst pretending, for the newcomer's benefit, to be discussing something entirely different. Marsh pushed the door open, and the room did what rooms like these always do when a policeman enters unannounced. It didn't fall silent, that would have been too obvious, but it thinned. Conversations trailing off mid-sentence, eyes finding their pints with sudden interest. He counted the room. 12 men, most of them well past 50, several he recognised as having been visibly present in the village that evening, doing absolutely nothing, while 6 younger men half their age had gone into the dark wood looking for the missing child. He didn't raise his voice. He had learned early in his career that raising your voice in a room like this only gives people more permission to raise theirs back, and he'd rather they stayed off balance. A 7-year-old boy is missing in the hollow, he said to the room generally. Has been gone for 5 hours. I'd like to know why most of the men in this village found better things to do than help to look for him. Nobody answered straight away. A few men shifted in their seats. The landlord, a stout, unhelpful man named Willett, busied himself with glasses that did not need cleaning. Eventually, the older man near the fire, thin, weathered, with the unmistakable slur of several hours drinking behind his words, spoke without quite looking up. "You'll not find him," the man said. "Not whole any road." "And you are?" "Ephraim Dowd." The old man raised his glass a little, a mockery of a toast. "Lived here man and boy 61 years. Watched this village lose something into that wood every few summers since I were younger than you, Constable, and watched it do sod all about it every single time." There were a few uncomfortable moments around the room. Men who clearly wished Dowd would keep drinking rather than talking. Marsh noted that too. "Then tell me why," Marsh said. "Because I've had a young man tell me tonight there's a creature living in that wood, and I don't care much for stories, Mr. Dowd, I care for facts. So if you know something factual, I'd like to hear it." Dowd laughed, not a pleasant sound. "Facts, aye? Well then, here's a fact for you, Constable. You know the road south, the one that's near gone under now, weeds up through the stones, leads down to a handful of houses folk round here called the Hollow Houses. Though they're their own name for the place, if you ask them, which you won't get out of most of us. What of it? Scorned lot they are. Always have been. My father's father would tell it. Folk down there kept to old ways long after the rest of the parish had the sense to give them up. Rites, doing round fires on the wrong nights of the year, wouldn't come to church, wouldn't bury their dead in consecrated ground. Village turned its back on them generations gone, and they turned theirs right back, and neither side's forgiven the other since." "And you think they have something to do with a missing child?" "I think," Dowd said, with the particular clarity that sometimes surfaces through a drink right before it disappears again. That whatever's in those woods didn't crawl up out of the ground on its own, Constable. Something like that wants making. And there's only one lot round here who ever had the taste for making things that oughtn't be made. He said nothing more after that. He drank instead, and the room's attention slid quietly away from him, and Marsh understood that he would get nothing further from anyone that night. Marsh did not believe in creatures made in the dark by scorned villagers with old grudges. He believed, if he believed anything at 11:40 at night after 5 hours in the wood that had swallowed a child, that frightened people reach for old stories the way a drowning man reaches for anything at all, and that Ephraim Dowd's tale said rather more about the Thorncombe's grudges than about the Hollow's dangers. But it was, he had to admit, the first concrete thing anyone had told him all evening, and a policeman follows the threads he's given, whatever he privately thinks of where it leads. He set out the following morning before the search party had properly assembled, telling Cole he'd rejoin them by mid-morning. The county had sent 2 dogs and 3 more constables overnight, and the search of the hollow itself was, for the moment, in more capable hands than his alone. The road Dowd had spoken of was easy enough to find, and considerably harder to walk. It had once, evidently, been a proper cart track, but decades of disuse had let grass and bramble reclaim most of it, so that Marsh spent the better part of 40 minutes picking his way along the green corridor, barely wide enough for a single man, hedgerows crowded in him from both sides. The hamlet, when he reached it, was smaller than he had expected. 5 houses, perhaps 6, arranged loosely around what might once have been a green, and was now simply rough grass gone to seed. No shop, no chapel that he could see, though there was a low stone structure at the centre of the cluster that might once have served some communal purpose, and now stood roofless, open to the sky. Smoke rose from one chimney only. The rest of the houses had that peculiar stillness of places either abandoned or occupied by people who did not want their occupation noticed. He knocked at the house with smoke rising, since it seemed the likeliest to yield an answer. It took a while for the door to open, long enough that Marsh had begun composing a second knock, and when it did open it revealed a woman perhaps 70 years old, small and spare, with white hair worn loose rather than pinned, and eyes that fixed on him with attention he found faintly unsettling, not hostile exactly, but entirely without the deference or curiosity most people showed a police uniform. "Constable," she said, before he introduced himself, as though the uniform alone had told her everything she needed. "Good morning. I'm sorry to trouble you. My name is Constable Marsh, up from Thorncombe. There's a child missing. Went into the hollow woods yesterday evening, and hasn't been found. I wondered if anyone here might have seen or heard anything." The woman regarded him for a long moment before answering, and when she did, her voice carried none of the drunken theatre Dowds had the night before. It was calm and flat, and entirely certain of itself. "We've seen nothing. Our children are accounted for, every one, and have been all night. You'll find no answers here, Constable. Only trouble you've no need of." "I wasn't suggesting anyone here was responsible," Marsh said, which was not entirely true. "I was told there might be knowledge here of the wood, of what's in it." Something shifted in the woman's face, so briefly he nearly missed it. Not fear, something closer to weariness, the expression of someone asked yet again to account for a thing that considered none of the asker's business. "There's things in these woods older than your village, and older than mine both," she said. "What's in there is not of our making, whatever they've told you up the road, and it is not our trouble to solve. It comes and it takes what it takes, and it has done since before either of our grandparents drew breath. You'd do better looking after your own house before you come knocking on ours." "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning," she said, "keep clear of us, Constable, and we'll keep clear of you, and neither of us will be trouble to each other. That's how it's been kept peaceable this long. I'd not go changing the arrangement if I were you." And with that she shut the door. Not slammed, simply closed with the finality of someone who had considered the conversation entirely concluded. Marsh stood in the step a moment longer, aware of the stillness of the other houses around him, aware, though he could never say exactly why, of being watched from more than one of those dark windows, despite there being no visible sign of anyone at all. He walked back up the green lane with the distinct sense of having learned both nothing and something at once, and no clear idea which of those was true. By the time he reached Thorncombe again, it was gone noon, and the village had a charged stillness of a place that something had just happened. He found the green crowded, more people than he'd seen assembled at once since arriving 3 weeks earlier, and this time there were women among them, and older men too, standing at the edges with their faces set hard. Daniel Coe met him halfway across the green, and Marsh knew from his face before a word was said. "Another one's gone," Coe said. "Young Robert Hale, Peter's cousin. Went up to the treeline himself this morning. Wouldn't wait for the search proper to start again. Said he wanted to look for the boy by his own account. Went up around 10. His mother went looking for him and not an hour passed. Found his cap on the wall and nothing else." Marsh felt something in his chest tighten. Not quite panic, but its close cousin. The sensation of a situation slipping past the edges of what the procedure could account for. How old? 19. A grown young man then, not a child who might simply have wandered and fallen somewhere. Marsh's mind ran quickly through the possibilities. An accident, a fall down the old mine shaft, something explicable, and found each of them had been thinner than the last. The 2 county dogs, he learned, had been all but useless by mid-morning. Casting about at the tree line, whining, and then simply refusing to enter the wood at all, no matter how their handler coaxed them. The 3 constables sent out with them had fared little better, covering a wide loop of the hollow southern edge without turning up so much as a footprint, and had gone back to report their failures to the station rather than wait about for the search that plainly considered a lost cause. Marsh noted it without much surprise. It was, by then, entirely in keeping with everything else the woods seemed to want to keep out of it. The search party that had assembled that afternoon was larger than the nights before, and markedly different in character. A dozen men now, several of them older, several carrying more than lanterns, Marsh noted, without immediately commenting on it, that at least 3 of the men had brought shotguns, broken open and carried properly over the arm, and one carried what looked like a woodman's axe. Nobody was chatting. There was none of that nervous, hopeful energy of a search for a lost child. This was a quieter, grimmer, and Marsh understood, with the sensation of a man realizing he has arrived somewhere in the middle of a conversation everyone else had already had without him, that these men were not expecting to find anyone alive. He fell in beside one of the older men, a stocky grey-beard farmer named Alfred Reeve, and asked him plainly what he expected to find. Reeve didn't slow his pace. "You keep looking for a lost boy, Constable. You'll keep finding nothing, same as last night. You want to find something, stop looking for a child wandered off, start looking for what's left of one. Makes it quicker, kinder too, in its way. Better you find it before the mother does." Marsh said nothing to that. There was nothing adequate to say. It was Reeve himself who found it, a little over an hour into the search, in a shallow depression some quarter mile from the tree line, screened on all sides by a thicket of holly that had clearly been chosen, if choice was a word, for how well it hid what lay within. Marsh heard the silence before he heard anything else. The calling of Tommy's name, which had continued steadily through the search, simply stopped, man by man, as each of them arrived at the thicket and looked, and said nothing. What remained of the boy was not, strictly, a body any longer. Marsh had seen death before, road accidents, a drowning once, a farmhand caught in a machinery, and he had believed himself reasonably prepared for whatever the woods might yield. He was not prepared for this. The marks were not the mark of a blade. Nothing about the scene suggested a person had done this with intent and a weapon. The ground was disturbed in a wide arc, the holly broken and flattened in a pattern that spoke of considerable weight and violence. And what could be seen of the injuries, Marsh made himself look only long enough to be certain of what he needed to be certain of, and no longer, bore the unmistakable character of teeth and claws, not tools. Something with jaws large enough and strong enough to have done this quickly. "Wolf," someone muttered. Though everyone present knew there had been no wolves in that county for over 100 years. Reeve said nothing at all. He simply looked at Marsh, a long, unreadable look, and then turned away to begin the grim practical business of arranging for the remains to be carried back. Marsh made himself catalogue what he could, the way his training told him to, the position of the body, the pattern of the wounds, the disturbance of the ground, even as some part of him, quieter and less easily silenced than usual, noted that no animal he knew left tracks quite like the ones pressed into the soft earth of the edge of the thicket. Too large, too deep, and oddly, unsettlingly, shaped almost, though he pushed that thought away as soon as it arrived, like something that had been walking upright. He told himself it was a wolf, or a large dog gone feral, or something equally explicable, because the alternative was not a thought he had any use for in the middle of an official investigation. He was not permitted to keep that comfort for very much longer. The light was already failing by the time the party began its return, carrying what needed to be carried, walking in a loose, exhausted line back toward the tree line and the field beyond. Marsh, methodical to the last, stayed behind the others by a short distance to make a final note of the thicket's position, for the report he'd need to write, and to mark the spot clearly enough that he could be found again in daylight. It was in doing this, crouched at the edge of the holly with his notebook, that the last of the party's voices already receding through the trees ahead, that he heard it. Not a large sound, not the crash of undergrowth he might have expected from something of the size that had made those tracks. Something smaller, more careful. A single deliberate footstep, off to his left, in the deepening shadow between the old oaks. He stood slowly, telling himself it was likely nothing, a deer, a fox, his own nerves playing tricks after the horror of the afternoon. He turned towards the sound, because a part of him, older than his training, insisted that he needed to know. For a moment he saw nothing, but the shapes of trees and the deep blue shadow gathering between them, and the last light draining fast from the sky above the canopy. Then the shadow moved. It was tall, taller than a man, though it stood with a stoop that made its true height difficult to judge, as though its frame had never quite settled into whatever shape it was meant to hold. Its limbs were the wrong in ways Marsh's mind struggled, in the first frozen second, to properly catalogue, too long in places, too thick in others, the proportions of something assembled rather than born. Coarse matted hair covered most of it, dark and filthy. But here and there Marsh could see skin beneath, grey and hairless and horribly bare, stretched taut over a frame that seemed built for mismatched pieces of two kinds of animal. The head was the worst of it, long like a hound's but too broad at the jaw, too heavy, the teeth visible enough that the mouth closed, jutting past what should have been the line of its lips, and the eyes, small, deep-set and entirely dreadfully aware, fixed on him with an intelligence that no ordinary animal's eyes would have carried. It did not move towards him, it simply looked, for what felt like a very long time, and was likely no more than 2 or 3 seconds, and then, with a fluid, wrong-jointed motion that Marsh would fail to properly describe in his report no matter how many times he tried, it turned and was gone to the deeper shadow of the wood, without sound, without haste, as though it had simply decided he was not, tonight, worth its trouble. Marsh did not remember afterward exactly how he got back to the tree line. He remembered running at some point. He remembered his own breath loud in his ears and the relief sharp enough to nearly buckle his legs. Of seeing lanterns on the others ahead of him at the field's edge. He did not tell them, not immediately, what he had seen. He was not entirely certain, in the first hour, that he trusted his own account of it. But he knew, with the cold certainty that settled somewhere beneath his training and his skepticism both, that whatever was in those woods was not a wolf, and it was not anything that belonged in a report written in the ordinary language of his profession. He told them that night, in the plough and sickle, to to a room that had grown considerably fuller since the news of Robert Hale's death. No one now pretended it might be anything else, had spread through every house in the village. He told it plainly, without embellishment, because he found that the plain telling of it, stripped of any attempt to make it sound reasonable, was somehow more convincing than any careful account might have been. A room of frightened people, he had learned over the last 2 days, did not need convincing. They needed only permission to say aloud what they had already, privately, decided was true. Nobody laughed. Nobody suggested he imagined it. Ephraim Dowd, considerably sober than the previous night, simply nodded slowly, as if a debt long overdue had finally been settled. "Now you've seen it," Dowd said. "You'll understand why we don't send our old ones into the wood after dark, Constable. It's not cowardice, it's knowing better." It was Alfred Reeve who spoke next, and his voice carried that peculiar weight of a man the room was inclined to listen to. "You went down the hollow houses this morning," Reeve said. It wasn't a question. "I did." "And what did they tell you?" "Very little. A woman there told me to keep clear of them and they'd keep clear of us." A murmur went round the room at that, not surprise, but something closer to grim confirmation. "That's their doing," said a woman near the back, whom Marsh didn't recognise. "Always has been. My grandmother told me they were put out of the parish 3 generations back for the things they did. Fires up at the old knights, things buried that should never have been buried, and things dug up that should never have been dug up either. They've hated this village every day since, for the shame of being cast out, and I'll not believe it's coincidence that whatever's out there start taking our children not long after." Marsh, ever the policeman, opened his mouth to point out that no one in the room had actually established when, precisely, disappearances had begun, and whether there was any real connection at all to beyond an old grudge and an older story, and then close it again, because he had, not 6 hours earlier, looked into the eyes of something that should not exist, and found that his appetite for insisting on evidence over instinct had rather sharply diminished. "Whatever it is," Reeves said, into the silence that followed, "and whoever's to blame for the making of it, it's in our wood, and it's taken 2 of ours in as many days, and it'll take more if we sit here arguing over whose fault it is. I say we finish it, tonight, while it still thinks there's only thing in the wood with teeth." There was no argument. Only a slow, hard nodding that moved around the room like a current, and men raising from their seats to fetch what they need, guns, axes, whatever iron and fire could be found, because more than one voice in that room, quietly and with a flat certainty of people repeating something learned long ago, said that fire was the surest thing against whatever that was. Marsh should, by every rule of his training, have counselled against it. A mob armed and moving in dark woodland after an animal none of them could properly describe was, by any sober measure, a recipe for further tragedy. But he had seen it. He had stood within 30 feet of the thing and felt, in some old unschooled part of himself, exactly what every person in that room already understood. That this would not end with reports filed and evidence gathered. It would end, if it ended at all, the way Reeve intended it to end. He picked up his own torch and went after them. They went into the hollow a little after 11, some 15 men strong, deliberately loud in a way that previous search parties had not been. Reeve's reasoning, spoken low to Marsh as they crossed the field, being that the thing had shown no fear of them and considerable confidence in its own ground, and that the surest way to draw a confident predator out was to sound and smell exactly like the prey worth the trouble of hunting. "You want it to find us," Marsh said. "I want it to come to us on ground we've chosen," Reeve said, "rather than us stumbling into it on the ground it's chosen. There's a difference, Constable, and it's the only difference that'll keep more of us alive than not tonight." They moved in a loose formation Reeve had clearly given some thought to, lanterns spaced to give overlapping light, and armed men positioned at intervals with the others between them, everyone within call of at least 2 others. It was, Marsh reflected, a rather better piece of tactical planning than he'd expected from a village of farmers and labourers, and he found himself wondering, briefly, and with a chill that he didn't examine too closely. Just how many times over the generations this particular exercise had needed repeating. But the knowledge of it, to do so well, to have settled so completely into instinct. The wood was different at night, with 15 men and their lanterns moving through it, than it had been previous evening with 6. Larger somehow, despite the greater light, the darkness beyond each lantern's reach pressing in closer for the contrast. Every shadow between the trees held breath. They found the first sign of it a little under an hour in, not the creature itself, but a mark on a great oak near the northern edge. 4 parallel gouges torn deep into the bark at the height well above a man's head, sap still weeping fresh and pale from the woods beneath. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Reeves simply nodded, once, as if the wood had confirmed something he'd already known, and the line moved on. It came for them a little after that. There was no warning beyond a single beat of absolute silence, the wood's constant low static of insects and wind falling away all at once, as though the whole of the hollow had drawn breath. Then it was among them. It came out of the dark between 2 lanterns, fast in a way its earlier stillness had not suggested, and the first man in its path, a younger farmhand Marsh didn't know the name of, was thrown bodily aside before anyone had properly registered the shape of the thing at all. Shouting, the crack of a shotgun, wasted into the dark as the creature moved too fast for anyone to properly aim. Lanterns swinging wild, throwing the whole clearing into a strobing, half-lit confusion of shapes and shadow. Marsh saw it clearly for only in flashes, the long jaw, wet now with something dark, the wrongly jointed limbs moving with a terrible leaping speed. Claws. He understood now why the ground back at the thicket had torn the way it had, raking through the air as it turned on the nearest man. 3 men went down in the first minute of it, not killed, Marsh would establish later with considerable relief, but badly torn. One with an arm laid open to the bone, another struck across the back badly enough that he would not walk unaided for weeks afterward, and a third caught a glancing blow to the scalp that bled with an alarming freedom of all head wounds, without proving, in the end, to be serious. The creature moved between them with a horrible economy, striking and moving on, as though it understood, with whatever passed for understanding in whatever remained of its mind, that scattering them mattered more than finishing any one of them quickly. It was Reeves' voice that turned it, cutting hard through the panic, not shouting in fear but barking direction, the voice of a man who had, perhaps, imagined this exact moment more than once and prepared himself for it. He called the armed men into a rough half-circle, forcing the creature to choose between retreat and a line of guns rather than scattered, panicked individuals. For a moment it hesitated, the first hesitation Marsh had seen from it, in either encounter, caught between the wounded stumbling for safety behind the line and the guns now levelled ahead of it. It chose to fight rather than flee, and that choice, in the end, was the one that finished it. 3 shots took it nearly together, close enough range that even panicked aim found its mark, and it went down thrashing into the bracken with a sound Marsh would not, in all of his years afterwards, ever fully manage to describe to anyone who asked. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream, but something that carried, even at the very end, an awful trace of something almost human beneath the animal register of it. It took a while to be certain it was truly dead. Nobody approached closely until Reeve himself, reloading with hands that Marsh noted were not quite steady, walked forward and put a final shot in it at close range. And even then the men held their distance a good while longer before anyone moved to properly look. In death, in the full light of the lanterns gathered close around it, the thing was somehow both less and more terrible than it had seemed in the moment of the attack. Less, because stillness robbed it of the terrible fluid wrongness of its movement, reduced it to simply a large, dead, malformed shape in the bracken. More, because stillness allowed them to look at it properly, and looking at it properly was its own particular horror. It was, as best any of them could determine, some grotesque conjunction of dog and man, though neither word sat comfortably on it. The skull was elongated like a hound's, but the brow above the eyes carried an unmistakable human weight to it, heavy and low, The hands, and Marsh made himself use that word because paws did not properly account for what he was looking at, ended in claws long and curved as knives, but the underlying structure beneath the coarse hair and grey hairless patches of skin was disturbingly close to a human's hand, his own architecture, 5 digits, an opposable thumb thickened and twisted into something closer to a blade. Its size alone would have made it monstrous even without the wrongness of its shape. Easily the bulk of 2 men, though gaunt in places, its ribs visible beneath matted fur in a way that suggested, oddly, something closer to starvation than strength. Nobody spoke for a long while. Marsh crouched near it with his notebook out from long habit, and found, for perhaps the first time in his career, that he had absolutely nothing adequate to write. It was Dowd, arriving late to the clearing with the others who had gone to fetch help for the wounded, who finally said what several of them had clearly already concluded, and none wanted to be the first to voice. "That's no wolf," Dowd said quietly. "And no beast neither, not proper. That's summat made." Nobody argued with him. Nobody this time needed convincing. They burned it where it lay, because more than one voice among them insisted, with the same flat certainty that had insisted on fire and iron before they'd ever entered the wood, that anything less would not properly finish it. Reeve organised the gathering of dry wood with the same brisk competence he'd shown in the fighting, and within the hour fire was built, high enough that the light it threw the surrounding trees into strange leaping relief. Marsh stood back from it, from the others, watching, and found himself thinking, not for the first time that night, though certainly with more force than before, that he understood now, in a way no amount of Dowd's stories or Reeve's grim planning could have taught him beforehand, exactly why this village kept the shape it kept, why its old men stayed home and its young men learned, without ever quite being told outright, how to move in formation through dark trees. The wounded were carried back well before the fire had burned down, taken to the doctor in the next village over, all 3 expected in time to recover. The rest of the party stayed until the fire had done its work, and only then, as the first grey suggestion of dawn began to touch the eastern sky above the tree line, did they finally make their way back to the hollow and across Miller's Field towards home. Thorncombe, in the days that followed, did not become an easy place exactly. 2 graves were dug that simply could not be filled, and a village of 41 houses does not simply set aside grief because the thing responsible for it has been found and burned. But something in the place did shift, in a way. Marsh found himself noticing over the following weeks as he settled properly into his new post. The old men who had made excuses on that first night began, gradually, to speak to him. Not warmly, not yet, but without that particular evasiveness that marked those early days. Alfred Reeve, in particular, took to stopping by his lodgings of an evening now and then, ostensibly to discuss Paris matters, though Marsh suspected the real purpose was simply to sit in the company of someone else who had stood in that clearing and understood, without needing to explain, what it had cost to stand there. The children returned to Miller's Field within a fortnight, though it was noted, without anyone needing to say it aloud, that they no longer played quite so close to the wall, and that the ball, when it went astray now, was always fetched by an adult standing near, and never by a child alone. Marsh wrote his official report in language that satisfies the county, without remotely capturing what had actually happened. A large feral animal, likely a wolf-dog hybrid of unusual size, responsible for 2 deaths, destroyed by a party of local men in defence of the village. It was, he reflected as he sealed the envelope, not exactly a lie, merely the truth arranged into a shape the world outside Thorncombe would be willing to accept. By the end of that August, the village had, in its quiet, unhurried way, began to feel something almost like ordinary again. The harvest came in well, the plough and sickle grew loud again of an evening, in the ordinary way of a village pub rather than the charged, watchful way it had been on that first terrible night. And Marsh, walking the green one warm evening in early September, found himself thinking that perhaps, cautiously, and with the woods still there at the edge of everything, still dark, still watched from a careful distance, Thorncombe might after all be settling into something like peace. He did not, in those weeks, go back down the green lane toward the hollow houses. nor did anyone else as far as he was aware. The old arrangement Reeve had described, keep clear of us and we'll keep clear of you, seemed for the moment to be holding on both sides, and Marsh had learned enough by then not to go looking for trouble that wasn't strictly presenting itself to him. He did not know, could not have known, and would not learn until long after the account properly ends, that peace in Thorncombe had never once meant an ending. Only, as it had always had before, interval. Down the green lane, past the last worn stones of the old cart track, in the hamlet that maps no longer trouble to name, a fire burned low on the roofless stone structure at the centre of the houses. It was tended by the same woman who had stood in the doorway some weeks before and told a young constable to keep clear. She knelt now at its edge, alongside 6 others, their faces lit gold and shifting in the low flame, their voices moving together in a low, unhurried chant carried no particular sorrow to it, and certainly no fear. Around the fire's edge, arranged with evident care, lay a scattering of small bones, old iron, and a handful of dark matted hair that had not come from an animal known to the parish above. They had lost something in the wood, weeks past now, though none among them grieved as it was Thorncombe had grieved its 2 dead. They had simply been unmade, the way such things are sometimes unmade, and the making of another was neither a difficult thing for them, nor an unfamiliar one. The woman's voice rose, very slightly, as the chant reached whatever point in its long, old shape called for, and the fire responded. Not with any kind of wind that any of the present could feel, but with a sudden leaning surge that threw shadows far up to the broken stone walls around them. Somewhere beyond the tree line, in the deep undisturbed dark of the hollow's oldest ground, something that had not existed a moment before drew, for the first time, something that might in time become a breath. The old woman smiled very slightly, and did not stop chanting. Thorncombe would have its peace a while yet, but peace in that county had never once been anything more than a space between them.